Hi there, welcome back to English 112. This is for our class for Tuesday, the 3rd, where we are talking about poetry. And I wanted to talk about Because I Could Not Stop for Death by Emily Dickinson, as well as American Poetry by Louis Simpson. And I think we can also squeeze in The Road Not Taken by Robert Frost. And we've got 2 classes left after this class to put closure onto poetry. And also, you know that we have paper number 2, which is on drama, and that's coming up as well. So in terms of Because I Could Not Stop for Death, one of the reasons why I wanted to assign this particular poem is because it's by Emily Dickinson, and Emily Dickinson is from Amherst, Massachusetts. In fact, you could even go and visit the Emily Dickinson house, or at least prior to COVID, you could go visit. I'm not quite sure what their regulations are now, but from an Amherst perspective, she's one of their most famous residents. And one of the things about Emily Dickinson is that her poetry is not particularly easy to read. And I think that over the years, I've come to see that as a strength and not necessarily as a weakness, and that we don't necessarily have to understand every single word. More often than not, she will give us a turn of a phrase that's just so well stated. For instance, I dwell in possibility, which is a phrase that has oftentimes been quoted in graduations. And it's just a lovely expression. The idea of dwelling as a home, but also dwelling as in thinking on, and all of the positives of dwelling, but also some of the negative consequences of dwelling on something too much. So, and of course, all of the elements associated with possibility. So, one of the things that I want you to take away from in terms of Emily Dickinson is that she perhaps is one of the best writers in terms of expressing abstract concepts such as feelings. I think that's one of the reasons why it's so difficult sometimes to understand her poetry, because it's difficult to articulate feelings. And one of the things that she oftentimes does is write about death, but rather than talk about death in a negative way, she talks about it as a positive, because of the possibility of an afterlife. Now, interestingly, Emily Dickinson wasn't very religious, at least not in terms of organized religion. But what she was very spiritual, and her God was one that could be evidenced in nature. So she talks about things that are very personal, her feelings and perspectives, but those feelings and perspectives are also universal, which is why I believe that she's such a popular poet. Expect things like biblical references in her poetry, which we do get in Because I Could Not Stop for Death. And note how she oftentimes breaks grammatical conventions with irregular capitalization, and more importantly, the use of the dash. And this is an interesting story as well, in that she wrote basically for herself, not necessarily to be published. And then after her death, her poems were published, they were gathered by her sister. And editors went and they corrected the poems to make it follow the conventions of grammar and mechanics. Of course, you know, you can't do that with poetry. Poetry oftentimes deliberately breaks those conventions. And her poetry really wasn't viewed as that interesting until many years later, an editor by the name of Johnson put together all her poetry in its original form with the irregular capitalizations and, more importantly, with the dashes. And the dash gives this kind of breathless, expectant quality to it that a comma just doesn't. And I also think it reinforces the idea that she was quite rebellious, and she oftentimes broke rules. As I said, that she didn't follow organized religion. For instance, she never married. She remained a spinster living in her father's house and basically isolated herself. I suppose the term we would use now is agoraphobia. But this isolation in her home allowed her to be able to create her art. So I don't know if we would have gotten her art without that isolation. And I wanted to read to you Because I Could Not Stop for Death. And notice as well that Emily Dickinson's poems, much like William Shakespeare's sonnets, were not titled. So we refer to Emily Dickinson's poetry by the first line. Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. The carriage held but just ourselves and immortality. We slowly drove, he knew no haste, and I had put away my labor and my leisure too, for his civility. We passed the school where children strove at recess in the ring. We passed the fields of gazing grain. We passed the setting sun. Or rather, he passed us. The dews drew quivering and chill, for only gossamer my gown and my tippet only tulle. We paused before a house that seemed the swelling of the ground. The roof was scarcely visible, the cornice in the ground. Since then 'tis centuries, and yet feels shorter than the day. I first surmised the horses' heads were toward eternity. And notice how I am reading eternity with the eh sound so that we can keep to the rhyme. Her writing and her poetry oftentimes followed the pattern of church hymnals, which is another way that she was subverting organized religion by using music that was associated with organized religion, but not necessarily to celebrate organized religion. And in this particular poem, it's a very personal poem, as her poems oftentimes are. They are about the I. That said, we can generate more than just an I from her poetry because it oftentimes is reflective of a we, humanity as a whole. I could not stop for death. Notice death is capitalized. That personifies death, giving an animate object human qualities. And basically, death is a kind of character, if you will, in this particular poem. And we don't stop for death. Death stops for us, in that we don't get to decide when our time comes. Death decides, we don't. Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. And notice that death is referred to as kind, which is unusual when you think about the usual conceptions of death. The carriage held but just ourselves in immortality. And this is the reason why death is kind, because death offers immortality. In other words, an afterlife. And there's a long literary tradition of talking about life as a journey. So they're in a carriage, horse-drawn carriage. Again, note the date, 1863. We slowly drove, he knew no haste. And notice how we've moved from the I to the we. In other words, death is not a solitary experience. And I had put away my labor and my leisure too for his civility. And basically, there isn't any reason to show haste because time is a human concept. Immortality, eternity, doesn't have the structure of time because time is limitless. And labor and leisure, those are also elements that are associated with the human world, not the spiritual world. So death has been called both kind and civil because he's eliminated things like labor or leisure. Leisure is only necessary because of labor, or the idea of haste. We passed the school where children strove at recess in the ring. So this is supposed to be an image of youth. And in our childhood, the beginning of our lives, we are in school. At recess in the ring, basically we are playing games like Ring Around the Rosie. But that's, if you know anything about that game, you know that it's about plague, which is a rather odd thing to be celebrating. But nevertheless, it was definitely it was definitely a time when, I almost sneezed. It was definitely a time when death was quite prevalent. Things like tuberculosis could ravage communities. We passed the fields of gazing grain, and that's supposed to represent adulthood. Gazing grain would be the farmlands. In other words, what we do as adults is work. We pass the setting sun, and that's supposed to represent old age, that the sun is setting, and the ending of our lives. Or rather, he passed us. The idea here is that they are moving away from the human world and they're moving into the spiritual world. The dews drew quivering and chill. In other words, there's a transition going on in the weather. It's turning to nightfall and cooler, but they also are transitioning out of the human world to the spiritual world. For only gossamer my gown. Gossamer is a very thin, oftentimes magical fabric. And the idea is that clothing is also a human construct that's necessary to either protect against the elements or because of social convention. Neither will be necessary in the afterlife. So she doesn't need a thick piece of material for her gown. And the same with her tippet, which is a shawl, only tulle. And tulle is also a very thin fabric. Think about the fabric that's used for wedding veils, for instance, or tutus, for instance. We passed before a house that seemed a swelling of the ground. House is capitalized. It could oftentimes be read as something like a church, but it could also be a tomb. It could also be her home. There is a tradition, oftentimes, when a body is going to be buried, that the body is taken before it arrives to the cemetery. It drives by the home of the deceased. It seems like a swelling in the ground because the house is so far away you can barely see it. It's just a little swelling in the ground. The roof was barely visible. That's how far away it is. And the cornice, which is an architectural element of a roof, in the ground. Again, it's so far away you just see a little bit of it peeking over the earth. Since then, 'tis centuries. This part is important. In other words, this all happened long ago. So this is proof of the afterlife because she's speaking from the perspective of afterlife. Since then, 'tis centuries and yet feel shorter than the day. I first surmised the horses' heads were towards eternity. And the idea of horses' heads is a biblical reference, the horsemen of the apocalypse. They would also be literal horses who would be dragging the carriage. And you can see some of the questions at the ending of the poem that help to direct your reading. Why couldn't the speaker stop for death? How is death personified in the poem? How does the speaker respond to death? Why are they accompanied by immortality? What is the significance of the things they passed in the third stanza? What is the house in lines 17 through 20? And discuss the rhythm of the lines. So this is a good example of Emily Dickinson's writing. I've learned to really appreciate Dickinson over the years. I admit that when I was in college, I wasn't terribly fond of her because I didn't understand her. And now I think that that's one of the reasons why I'm fond of her is because I don't always understand her. If we move on beyond Emily Dickinson, I wanted to give a poem that is not included in our textbook because I could not stop for death. I've included the link below as you can see, but it's also on page 847. This poem is entitled American Poetry, and there is a link for it, but there is no page number because it is no longer included in our textbook. But I thought it would be a wonderful poem to illustrate a shift that will be happening very soon from the kind of poetry that we have been reading, which is very traditional poetry, to some more contemporary poetry that takes much more risk and breaks many more rules. And in part, I think it's because it's a response or a reaction to the more traditional poetry of the past, which is one of the reasons why I wanted to make sure that we had the poetry pretty much in chronological order so that you could begin to see a little bit of progression. So this poem is entitled American Poetry by Louis Simpson. It's very short, and it reads, whatever it is, it must have a stomach that can digest rubber, coal, uranium, moons, poems. Like the shark, it contains a shoe. It must swim for miles through the desert, uttering cries that are almost human. So this poem was written in 1963, and it's about American poetry. The title of the poem is American Poetry. That'll be important in terms of understanding this poem, because the first line, when it says whatever it is a pronoun. It takes the place of a noun. The noun it happens to be replacing is American poetry. Now, if you got a writing assignment back from me where I had circled a pronoun in your paper, a word like it, and I might have said something like it what, unclear pronoun reference, be concrete. What that meant was within that actual sentence itself, the noun wasn't stated that the pronoun was replacing. You probably stated the noun in an earlier sentence, but each sentence should be evaluated as an independent grammatical unit. So whatever it is, or whatever American poetry is, it must have a stomach that can digest. So it should be able to accommodate all of these things. Rubber, coal, uranium, moons, poems. Now, all of these things are associated with America. Rubber would be the industry of America. Keep in mind Walter Younger talking about when are you going to open a rubber plant. Coal, which of course is another part of industry in the United States, especially in the 60s. Uranium, which is used for nuclear weapons. Moons, and again, think about the 1960s and the space race, and poems. However, you can also think about these things as having negative connotations as well, because coal is dirty energy, uranium can lead to destruction. Moons, yes, it is about moon exploration, but think about the past and how moons oftentimes were used in romantic ways, oftentimes exaggerated, hyperbole, where a moon or a star or the sun, much like in Shakespeare's sonnet, is presented as perhaps the epitome. But of course, in Shakespeare's sonnet, he contradicts that by showing that there are flaws, and his subject does not have flaws. So this is what poetry should be able to address. No longer does it have to be about lofty, important themes. No longer does it have to have a specific rhyme or meter to it. It's like the shark. This is the second stanza. Like the shark, it contains a shoe. Notice this idea of ingestion, of being able to eat. Also, the idea of a shoe means that sharks eat anything and everything. And perhaps that's what poetry should be about. Anything and everything. Sharks also eat garbage. It must swim for miles through the desert. And again, we're referencing American poetry. Of course, you can't swim through the desert. Think about how paradoxical that is and how difficult that is. And that's perhaps what poetry is. It's filled with difficulty and paradox. Uttering cries that are almost human. Notice the negative connotations here, not just to digestion and eating, but uttering cries. In other words, about pain or sadness, or if one is crying out for attention for something, that are almost human. Again, giving a very negative sense to it. Now, as I said, the upcoming poetry is going to be doing some of what American poetry suggests. But I thought I'd end today with a poem that is very traditional, and that is The Road Not Taken by Robert Frost. And there's a very good possibility that you've heard of this poem before, or perhaps have read this poem before prior to this class. One of the reasons why I wanted to give this particular poem is, first of all, there is an explication at the ending. In other words, somebody has gone through and analyzed this poem. So I wanted to show you how one could do such a thing. And also because it is oftentimes misread. Just like I had indicated that Shakespeare's sonnets are perhaps some of the most misread poems, especially the poem of Shall I Compare Thee to a Summer's Day, because it's not written to a woman. It's not a love poem. It's written to Shakespeare's patron, a man, and it's a poem of flattery. So The Road Not Taken. And the key here is the title. So I'll read the poem to you. This is on page 871, but I've also included a link in the notes below. Two roads diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both and be one traveler. Long I stood and looked down one as far as I could to where it bent in the undergrowth. Then took the other as just as fair, and having, perhaps, the better claim, because it was grassy and wanted wear, though, as for that the passing there had worn them really about the same. And both that morning equally lay, in leaves no step had trodden black. Oh, I kept the first for another day, yet knowing how way leads on to way, I doubted if I should ever come back. I shall be telling this with a sigh, somewhere ages and ages hence. Two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the road less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. So how is this poem misread? Because usually people say that this person took the less traveled road, and that was a positive. But note the title. The title is about the road not taken, not about the road taken. This is about a sense of regret and longing that perhaps accompanies all decisions we make, even decisions that we are content with, because there always is that what if in the back of our minds. And the two roads are representative of two choices. They diverged in a yellow wood, so we're in the forest, the wilderness, untamed. And sorry I could not travel both. Sorry that both choices or roads couldn't be chosen because one precludes another. And be one traveler, long I stood and looked down one as far as I could to where it bent in the undergrowth. So they're trying to evaluate the choices to determine which is better. Then took the other as just as fair. In other words, both roads look equally positive. And having perhaps the better claim, maybe perhaps one is slightly better because it was grassy and wanted wear, that others hadn't necessarily trodden on it, so it was less popular. But as that for the passing there had worn them really about the same. But now that I'm looking closely, it looks like both of them are worn pretty similarly. And both that morning equally lay. In that moment, both choices look equal. In leaves no step had trodden black. Oh, I kept the first for another day. Yet noting how way leads on to way, I doubt if I should ever come back. The hope that, well, if I choose one, then I can go back and choose the other. But it's very difficult to do such a thing because one choice leads to another choice, leads to another choice. So it's very difficult to backtrack. And I shall be telling this with a sigh. This could be a sigh of happiness, but it could also be a sigh of disappointment or regret. Somewhere ages and ages hence, in the future. Because we don't know how we are going to be evaluating our choices in the future. We only know how we will evaluate them in the present. Two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by. And that's made all the difference. And again, we don't know necessarily if that's positive or a negative. More importantly is the explication, because you remember that for the final exam, I'm going to ask you to explicate poetry. And I'm going to select a handful of poems and ask you to choose two and to explicate them. Now, I don't expect anything as well written as what you have in your textbook with the explication of this poem. This is something that you would write for a paper if we have paper number 3. But it'll give you a good idea of how you should have a beginning, a middle, an end, and you should be making direct references to the poem. So again, I don't expect anything as neat or as polished or as developed, but I wanted to read this explication to you. This is on page 872. The road not taken intrigues readers because it is at once so simple and so deeply resonant. Recalling a walk in the woods, the speaker describes how he came to a fork to the road, which forced him to choose one path over another. Though sorry he could not travel both, he made a choice. There's no other action in the poem. However, the incident is charged with symbolic significance by the speaker's reflections and the necessity and consequences of the decision. And notice that, I'll stop here for a second and note that he could not travel both is in quotation marks because that's a direct reference to the actual language used in the poem. The final stanza, and let me stop here and say, note that you don't necessarily have to go in chronological order when you're talking about a poem. The final stanza indicates that the choice concerns more than simply walking down a road, for the speaker says that choosing the, quote, less traveled, unquote, path has affected his entire life, and, quote, that's made all the difference, unquote. Frost draws on a familiar enough metaphor when he compares life to a journey, but he's also calling attention to a less commonly noted problem. Despite our expectations, aspirations, appetites, hopes, and desires, we can't have it all. Making one choice precludes another. It is impossible to determine what particular decision the speaker refers to. Perhaps he has to choose a college, a career, or spouse. Perhaps he was confronted with mutually exclusive ideas, beliefs, or values. There's no way to know, because Frost wisely creates a symbolic choice and implicitly invites us to supply our own circumstances. The speaker's reflections about his choice are essential to an understanding of the poem as the choice itself. Indeed, they may be more central. He describes the road taken as, quote, having perhaps the better claim, / because it was grassy and wanted wear, unquote. He prefers the, quote, less traveled, unquote, path. This seems to be an expression of individualism, which would account for, quote, the difference, unquote, his choice made in his life. But Frost complicates matters by having the speaker also acknowledge that there were no significant differences between the two roads. One was, quote, just as fair, unquote, as the other. each was, quote, worn really about the same, unquote. And, quote, both that morning equally lay slash in leaves no step had trodden back, black, unquote. Now, I'll stop here and ask you to note that when I say slash, this is how you indicate a break in a line of poetry if you are quoting from a poem and inserting it within your own writing. So the slash indicates that this is where one line ended, and on the other side of the slash, which is where the new line began. Because, of course, poetry has staggered lines oftentimes. I'll continue reading the explication. The speaker imagines that in the future, ages and ages hence, he will recount his choice with, quote, a sigh, unquote, that will satisfactorily explain the course of his life. But Frost seems to be having a little fun here by showing us how the speaker will embellish his past decision to make it appear more dramatic. What we hear is someone trying to convince himself that the choice he made significantly changed his life. When he recalls what happened in, quote, the yellow wood, unquote, a color that gives a glow to that irretrievable moment when his life seemed to be on the verge of a momentous change, he appears more concerned with the path he did not choose than with the one he took. Frost shrewdly titles the poem to suggest the speaker's sense of loss and not being able to, quote, travel both, unquote, roads. When the speaker's reflections about his choice are examined, the poem reveals his nostalgia, instead of affirming his decision to travel a self-reliant path in life. The rhyme stanzas of The Road Not Taken follow a pattern established in the first 5 lines, A, B, A, A, B. The rhyme scheme reflects, perhaps, the speaker's efforts to shape his life into a pleasing and coherent form. The natural speech rhythms Frost uses allow him to integrate the rhymes unobtrusively, but there's a slight shift in lines 19 and 20, when the speaker asserts self-consciously that, quote, the less traveled, unquote, road, which we already know to be basically the same as the other road, quote, made all the difference, unquote. Unlike all the other rhymes in the poem, quote, difference, unquote, does not rhyme precisely with hence. The emphasis must be placed on the difference to make it rhyme precisely with hence, which may suggest that the speaker is trying just a little too hard to pattern his life on his earlier choice in the woods. So I'm going to stop here and note that this particular explication does talk about the structure of the poem, in this instance, the rhyme scheme. And remember, we talked about that we could talk about rhyme or we could talk about meter. But if you are going to mention it, then you need to talk about how it is important in terms of our understanding the poem, which is what this author tried to do by saying, and notice that he couched his argument in perhaps this rhyme scheme of A, B, A, B, indicates the speaker's efforts to shape his life into a pleasing and coherent form. And then lastly, the last paragraph, which I wish was a little longer because a paragraph should be minimum 3 sentences, and this one isn't, but it still serves as a conclusion. Perhaps the best way to begin reading Frost's poetry is to accept the invitation he placed at the beginning of many volumes of his poems. The pasture means what it says, of course. It is about taking care of some farm chores. But it's also a means of saying one thing in terms of another. And perhaps that's the definition of poetry. It's a means of saying one thing in terms of another. So I thought I would stop here because we have 2 more classes left to talk about poetry. And in terms of today's attendance question, which would be due on Thursday at 10 a.m., basically, since I had previously asked you which poem did you like the best, I thought I could ask you based on these poems, and I'll also include The Sick Rose, which we did very briefly before I devoted a class to working on paper number 2. Which of these poems did you dislike the most and why? Whether it be The Sick Rose, Because I Could Not Stop for Death, American Poetry, or The Road Not Taken. And it's perfectly fine to dislike as well as to like. Of course, the interesting part is why. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class with poetry. Take care. Bye-bye.